Alright, so in this video, we're going to be going over words in context or vocab questions, which falls under the craft and structure domain. So these vocab questions, they're the most common type of question on the SAT, and you're going to get a bunch of them right at the beginning of each module. So there are two kind of ways a question could go. You'll either have to pick a word to fill the blank in a passage, or you're going to have to figure out what an underlined word means in the context of a passage. So again, words can have multiple meanings, but you need to figure out what it means in that specific scenario. So these can be really confusing because sometimes you'll see words that you just don't know, and sometimes the passages themselves are kind of tricky and you don't really know what they're trying to say or what the definition should be. But why you can't always like get over the fact that you don't know a certain word, there are still strategies you can use to help figure out, at least eliminate some words. So the best strategy is to look for the keywords and the phrases. You really need to read these passages very carefully. Like, you can't just skim, because there's like a definition and or a synonym hidden somewhere in that passage. There is specific wording that is pointing you pretty clearly to the direction of what it should mean. And there are often like multiple sentences for these fill in the blank questions, especially. And sometimes the second a sentence is sometimes just elaborating or giving an example of the same idea. So even if you don't understand what the blank should be from the first sentence, you have to look at the whole passage to understand the main idea. You need to understand what you're talking about to see what exactly that word should be. So you have to really read each word and each word really carefully. Once you kind of figure that out, you want to try to come up with your own guess. Again, it can be your own word or at least like a short definition of what you think the word should mean. When you start plugging in the answer choices, your mind is going to want to like make certain things fit. But if you kind of come up with your own idea what it should mean first, it's going to help you kind of stay on track and not get confused by answer choices that look right, even though they might really not be the right answer that really fits the meaning of the text. A really good tip in these questions is to figure out the tone of the passage. Even if you don't know exactly what it should mean, you want to see, should the words be positive, negative, or neutral? Like, are we talking about something really positively here, or are we talking about it really negatively? Because if it's a should be really positive word, then you can eliminate all the negative or neutral answer choices, and vice versa. So this is a good, really popular strategy to use, because sometimes you don't know exactly what it should mean, but you can eliminate some choices based on just the tone of the word, understanding the tone of the passage. Again, like I said, sometimes you can't always use tricks to understand words that you haven't seen before, but try to use roots to help you figure out words you don't know. So look at kind of the beginning of the word and think, are there any words that I do know that kind of look the same or start the same way at least? Because you might know those definitions, and that might help you figure out some of the big words, or at least maybe get a hint of what they mean, which, anything helps. Again, you can't use this all the time. Sometimes you might not be able to recognize them, but I will try to do my best to point out roots, common roots in the English words that might help you sometimes. And again, the main thing is to figure out the main idea of the passage, because the word has to reinforce the meaning of the text. Just remember, just because you have that blank in there doesn't mean you can't understand the passage. Read each and every word, and once you get an idea of the passage, what the main idea is, it's going to help you figure out what we're talking about, what adjective or verb you're supposed to be using in this situation. All right, so let's read it out loud. In the mid-19th century, some abolitionist newspapers blank Western migration in the United States. By printing a letter that described the easy fortunes and high salaries miners could make in California during the gold rush, Frederick Douglass's newspaper North Star was one such publication that inspired readers to locate. Okay, so what are we talking about here? We're talking about how these newspapers were inspiring readers to relocate. And we're talking about Western migration. And we can see that they're talking really positively about moving west. So you can make easy fortunes and high salaries that miners could make during California during the gold rush. So these are good things. We're saying good things about moving west to California or something. So you can see that even though this gap here just in this first sentence is kind of confusing, the second sentence kind of gives us all the context we need. We're talking really positively about Western migration, so we kind of want a positive word. Another way that you can look at this is that the end of the second sentence is kind of almost like the same sentence as the first part. So the newspaper North Star was one such publication, is like some abolitionist newspapers that inspired readers to relocate. And here to relocate means Western migration. So if I had to come up with my own guess word, I'd come up with something like inspired or promoted. They inspired Western migration in the United States. So here, just from this word, I can see like inspired would fit here. Obviously, it's probably not going to be the same word, but I want a word like inspired or promoted, a verb that's really positive, because these newspapers were kind of talking positively and wanted people to move west. So take a second to see which word best fits with that. So I think stimulated is the best one. So stimulated kind of means to excite, or to kind of to kind of excite something, to get something to do, to get someone to do something by exciting them about it. And I think that's what they're doing. They're exciting people by talking about how much money they can make in California when they go west. So that's why I really like stimulating. If you don't know what stimulating means, then we can still eliminate B, C, and D. Opposed is kind of the opposite thing. Opposed means they were against Westward migration, which doesn't make any sense. Disregarded means they didn't care about Westward migration. That also doesn't make any sense. So opposed and disregarded are both negative words. We don't want negative words, right? We want a really positive word. They just don't make sense. And then be assigned doesn't really make sense. Assigned Westward migration means kind of like your teacher will assign you an assignment. They're not telling people like you have to go west. They're kind of promoting people to go west. Saying assign means like they're forcing them to go west. Their newspaper, they can't force anybody to do anything, right? So assigned doesn't really make a lot of sense in this context. So stimulated, even if you don't know what it means, B, C, D, you can still kind of eliminate those. They don't make any sense. And stimulated means to excite, to inspire. So that's why stimulated is going to be the best answer. Let's read out our next one. As a young photographer in the 1950s, William Klein blanked the conventions of photography by creating images that were high contrast and included blurred and distorted images, features generally seen as flaws. So unorthodox was Klein's work that he had difficulty finding a publisher for his now iconic 1956 photo book, Life is Good and Good for You, in New York. Okay, so what's kind of the main idea here? We're talking about this William Klein guy who's a photographer. And what is it saying about his photos? Well, we're talking about the conventions of photography. So we probably need a verb here, right? So he's doing something to the conventions of photography. So there's a lot of words in here that's pointing us in the right direction. So we can see that his photography, he created images that were contrast, blurred, distorted, and they had features that were generally seen as flaws. So he still, even though they were generally seen as flaws by these conventions, which is kind of like the standard or like the normal thing to do, he still made photography that was sort of unusual, okay? Even if he didn't get it at that point, they still have another sentence kind of talking about the same idea. Unorthodox kind of means, if you've heard this word, you don't have to know this word to get the meaning. Unorthodox kind of means like out of the ordinary, unusual. So that's another kind of synonym. Whereas Klein's work, that he had difficulty finding a publisher. So even if you don't know what unorthodox means, if he had difficulty finding a publisher, that means like people didn't like his work. It was kind of weird, for the reason that they listed, that they were blurred and distorted elements. So these photos were weird. These photos were unusual. So if I had to come up with a guess word, since he made photos that were unusual, I think he's opposing or like going against the conventions, because conventions is like, what are the conventional ways to do photography? He's not being conventional, he's being unique. He's kind of being innovative. So I kind of want a negative word because he's kind of reacting negatively to those conventions. He's not supporting those conventions. He's opposing. He's going against the conventions because he had weird photos. So if I had to see which word worked best, take a second. I'd say it's defied. So pretty much what we said, defied means like defying, going against the conventions. That's pretty much what he's doing. Let's look at the other answer choices. A, reviewed. That doesn't really make any sense. Reviewed is like you're looking over the conventions. No, he's defying them. So reviewed is sort of like a neutral word. That means he's not really doing anything to the conventions. He's just reviewing them. That doesn't really make a lot of sense in this context. C, respected. That's kind of the opposite. He's not respecting the conventions, he's defying them. If he respected the conventions, that means he'd sort of follow them. He'd be like, yeah, I'm kind of going according to the conventions of photography, but he's making photos that are unusual. So respected is kind of the opposite of what we need. And then D, prevented. He can't prevent the conventions of photography because, like, this is just something people do. So there's no way that he can prevent people from following conventions or prevent the conventions from stopping just because he's making photos that are unusual. So it's kind of impossible. I don't think that's what the author wants to say. We just want to know that Klein is kind of defying the conventions, or he defied the conventions of photography because he made photos that were unusual, that he had difficulty finding a publisher and all of that. So you can see that there's a lot of clues in this passage, in the specific wording, that is kind of pointing you to the fact that he's going against the conventions of photography. Okay, this is our last one. So the following text is adapted from Mary Seacole's 1857 autobiography, Wonderful Adventures of Mrs. Seacole in Many Lands. Okay. The journey across the Isthmus of Panama, insignificant in distance as it was by no means an easy one. This journey was not an easy one. It seemed as if nature had determined to throw every conceivable obstacle in the way of those who should seek to join the two great oceans of the world. Okay, so this one is kind of, I think it's easy to understand. I think the main idea is that she's on this journey and just she's facing a lot of natural obstacles on this journey, on this Isthmus of Panama, which is how you can walk across like two great oceans of the world, I guess. I don't know. And we're talking about this underlined word is conceivable. So I still have to figure out what it means, right? So there are not a lot of hints necessarily in this short sort of passage. One keyword is kind of like every. If I had to kind of come up with my own guess, I'm talking about like it's like every possible obstacle in the way because it's so hard. And nature was determined to throw every conceivable obstacle. So it kind of sounds like to me like nature is determined to throw every like single obstacle it has in her way as she's trying to cross this and go on her journey. So if you do know what conceivable means, conceive is kind of to imagine or to think something. You can also think of like conceiving, like having a baby, or it's like anything you can have. So like every obstacle you could have, or every obstacle you could think of, every possible obstacle is being thrown in the way of that who thrown in her way as she's trying to go on her journey. So there aren't a lot of hints necessarily, but we can say because it's not an easy one, not an easy journey, and nature was so determined to throw every obstacle, we can mean that there's like a lot of crazy natural obstacles. It's just not stopping. It's just like everything you can think of, sort of. So take a second to see which one makes the most sense. Okay, so I think imaginable best matches up kind of with our logic here. I think this one's a little tricky because some of these words, like if you don't know what conceivable means, there aren't as many hints in this one that can kind of mislead you. So, obvious. Every obvious obstacle is kind of weird because if we say obvious obstacle, it's almost like we kind of expect the obstacles. It kind of makes them sound like less scary than they seem to be because these obstacles are clearly very difficult because this journey was by no means an easy one, right? So these obstacles are maybe a little unpredictable, a little crazy, okay? Because nature was so determined to throw. So obvious is kind of almost like downgrading that or kind of downplaying how hard these obstacles are. Obvious makes it sound like they're kind of easy to overcome. So I don't really like that word. C, straightforward. I think same problem, like every straightforward obstacle, that means these obstacles are maybe easy, like they're straightforward, like I know how to pass through them sort of obstacles, but that doesn't make sense because they're clearly making her time journeying really hard, right? So straightforward doesn't really match up in this context. And D, uninterrupted, every uninterrupted obstacle, that just doesn't really make a lot of sense to me. I think imaginable is the clearest one. It's like every possible obstacle, every obstacle that you can imagine, nature was determined to throw in my way and make my journey really hard. So here, if you kind of think about it, try to kind of guess your own word, even if you're not totally sure what conceivable means. You just kind of want to get the main idea that it's just like every single obstacle that you can think of, a lot of obstacles. So every imaginable obstacle makes the most sense in this situation. All right, so the work of molecular biophysicist Enrique M. de la Cruz is known for blanking traditional boundaries between academic disciplines. Okay, the university laboratory that de la Cruz runs includes engineers, biologists, chemists, and physicists, and the research the lab produces make use of insights and techniques from all those fields. Okay, so again, there are a lot of words that are pointing us in the right context. So his work of this De La Cruz guy is known for doing something to the traditional boundaries between academic disciplines. So what are we doing to these traditional boundaries? Well, the second sentence tells us that. The laboratory he runs includes all sorts of different, people from all sorts of different academic disciplines or kind of subjects. So like biologists, physicists, chemists, you know, and the research makes use of insights and techniques from all those fields. So even if you don't get that this is listing people from like different sorts of subjects, we can say that we can see from the fact that it makes use of insights and techniques from all those fields that we're not operating between traditional boundaries. We're actually crossing those traditional boundaries, right? So the main idea is that his work combines many academic fields, not just one, or we're not staying in one academic discipline. We're taking work from many academic disciplines. So I think our guess should be like crossing traditional boundaries or breaking them so we can make more insights from different people in different fields to do the best work that we can, right? So see which word kind of sounds like crossing or breaking the traditional boundaries. Okay, here I think it would have to be transcending. So I think these top two words may be a little confusing. Epitomizing, it's probably hard to think of a word that sounds like epitomizing, but to epitomize means to kind of be like the exemplar for something. Epitomize is to kind of be a really good example of something. So I think here it's kind of the opposite, because if it's known for epitomizing traditional boundaries, that means it would be like an example of staying in traditional boundaries, not breaking traditional boundaries, but like being an example, like we operate in traditional boundaries. That's what it means to epitomize something. It means to kind of become that thing almost. But we're breaking the traditional boundaries. We're not being an example of traditional boundaries. So epitomizing is the opposite of what we want to say. Transcending, here the root trans can kind of help you, like transform means to cross from one thing into the other, or translate means to move from one language to the other. So trans kind of means like crossing over. Trans is a root that kind of means crossing. So transcending just sort of means like crossing over traditional boundaries. So you can use the root trans to help you figure out what transcending means. I think there's a lot of words that start with trans. I just listed a few. But transcending means to cross over. So I think that's pretty much what we said. C, anticipating. Anticipating is like predicting, and I don't really know if that makes a lot of sense in this situation. We're not predicting, we're not anticipating anything, so that doesn't make a lot of sense. And then de-reinforcing, that's the opposite, because reinforce means to like be like, yes, this is right. We're not reinforcing traditional boundaries, we're doing the opposite, we're breaking them. If we were reinforcing traditional boundaries, same problem as epitomizing, that would mean that we are following traditional boundaries. We're saying that we should only work in one discipline at a time, but that's the opposite of what we want to say, right? That means we're transcending traditional boundaries, we're crossing traditional boundaries. So here, I think the second sentence is kind of giving you the definition of what the word should be. We're combining work from many fields and breaking those boundaries. All right, so here we have a fiction passage. So the following text is from the novel The Great Gatsby. You might have heard of that before. Jay Gatsby was balancing himself on the dashboard of his car with that resourcefulness of movement that is so peculiarly American. that comes, I suppose, with the absence of lifting work in youth and, even more, with the formless grace of our nervous, sporadic games. This quality was continually breaking through his punctilious manner in the shape of restlessness. Okay, and you need to see what the word quality most nearly means. All right, so this is a little tricky because I think the language is a little confusing, but if I had to kind of summarize it, we're talking about this guy Gatsby, and we start off by talking about how he's balancing himself on the dashboard of his car with that resourcefulness of movement, blah, blah, blah. So I think we're talking about that resourcefulness of movement. And so when we're saying this quality, what are we referring to? I think we're talking about that resourcefulness of movement with which he's like balancing himself or like with which he's moving around, with which he's behaving. And so we're saying this is continually breaking through his punctilious manner in the shape of restlessness. So if I'm thinking about like manner, I'm definitely talking about how he's behaving. So I'm talking about how Gatsby is behaving in a specific way. And I think manner, I didn't underline it, but manner is going to be your best sort of hint here because manner is like how you behave yourself, right? So we're talking about his manner, how he's behaving. So this quality or is kind of like this behavior, this trait. This behavior was continually breaking through his punctilious manner in the shape of restlessness. We're talking about his manner, right? So if we're talking about the manner, the way you behave, we're talking about like a trait, this trait of his, that resourcefulness of movement, which is so American, it's kind of breaking through the way he's behaving or holding himself. So the word manner should point you to like words like behavior or trait, something about his character, how he's behaving or presenting himself. So take a minute to see which one best matches up with that. I think characteristic is sort of like a behavior or trait, right? But it's characteristic, that resourcefulness of movement, that characteristic was breaking through his manner, the way that he's acting, right? Because when we're talking about how you're acting, how you're presenting yourself, you're talking about your traits, your qualities, like quality as in like facts about you, how you are. So that's why characteristic makes the most sense. Now, the other ones are a bit confusing, but I think you can kind of eliminate them because some of them mean the same sort of thing. So, standard is kind of like a standard how you hold yourself, or standard is like an expectation people have of you. We don't know if people expect him to have that resourcefulness of movement. We don't know if he expects himself to have that resourcefulness of movement. Like, it's not a standard necessarily. It's just like a trait of being so American. A standard is like something you have to be, like beauty standards, how beautiful have to be. But we don't know if this resourcefulness and movement thing, how he's behaving himself, is the standard for the type of man he is. So I'm not sure if standard is going to be the best one. Because by standard, quality usually means like how good something is. So then maybe that's what I mean by standard, but I don't think that's what that means in this situation. Be prestige. Prestige is like some sort of pride or like some sort of like royal and a rich sort of designation. So I don't know if this resourcefulness and movement necessarily is like prestigious. I mean, it does say that like he didn't lift work in his youth and like had formless grace of our nervous sporadic games. So, like maybe that might show that he isn't necessarily poor if he wasn't lifting work in youth or something like that. But prestige, we don't know if he's like rich or we don't know if he's like super famous or something. We don't know if he's like a prestigious person, even if you might maybe get that vibe. We don't really know that for sure from this text. That's kind of a stretch. So prestige is kind of not the best word to use here. And then accomplishment, this is just a character trait. We don't know if like the way he's behaving is an accomplishment, so that's kind of out of kind of irrelevant because he's just behaving this way. We don't know if I really doubt that the way he's behaving is some sort of an accomplishment. I don't think that's what the author is trying to say. We're just saying like this is sort of like a unique way that he's behaving, a unique way that he's like showing himself through his body, unique body language through his manner or his behavior. So we're talking about like characteristics of this sort of unique person. Everything else is sort of a reach. Because Jay Gatsby in the book is sort of like this rich, super rich person. So maybe if you have that background, you're going to choose like prestige or standard because like he's a really rich person and rich people have standards and they have prestige. But you don't know that from this passage. So if that's outside knowledge that's kind of hurting you, kind of ignore that because all you have is the text in front of you. And from the text in front of you, I don't know, Gatsby could just be some like middle class guy. Like we don't know if prestige or standard really fits. We just know that this is a characteristic of this person. That's what we mean by quality, a characteristic. So again, even if I don't understand everything, as long as you get the main idea that like it's just talking about how he's behaving in a specific way, how he has a specific sort of a manner, those words like behavior and manner should be able to get you towards like behavior, trait, and characteristic. All right, a journalist and well respected art critic of 19th century Britain, Lady Elizabeth Rigby Eastlake did not hesitate to publish reviews that went against popular opinion. One of her most divisive works was an essay questioning the idea of photography as an emerging medium for fine art. In the essay, Eastlake blanks that the value of photographs was informational rather than creative. You gotta fill in the blank. So we need to figure out what she's doing that the value of photographs was informational rather than creative. Okay, so just to get a main idea of this passage, let's look at some key words. So she's an art critic, right? So she's someone who kind of gives her opinion about art. That's what an art critic is. Criticizes art, says what she thinks about it. And she did not hesitate to publish reviews. So she was kind of proud. She was kind of loud and proud about her views. She didn't hesitate to, give her opinion about art or whatever. So she was really proud, really bold in her critiques, bold about her opinions. Yeah, again, so we're talking about opinions. You're going to see why I'm kind of highlighting the word opinions over and over again. And we're saying that one of this work about these photographs being informational rather than creative was very divisive. So whatever opinion she had, like some people maybe agreed and some people, maybe were really against her views. So her opinion kind of divided a lot of people. And it was essay questioning the idea of photography. So she's not necessarily, demeaning photography. She's just kind of like questioning the idea of photography as counting as fine art. So she's just kind of questioning, arguing that, photographs aren't really art, they're more informational. So to kind of give a main idea to this, she proudly voiced her opinion that photos aren't really art. That's kind of the main idea I got from this. If I had to pick a word from here, again, in essays, what do you do in an essay? You kind of argue. So because she's so brave about it, because she's a critic, because she's putting her opinion, you kind of argue your opinion in an essay. And because she's does not hesitate to publish reviews, I want a word that means argued or like argued strongly in an essay. So let's see which words kind of match up with that. Here I think asserted would be the best answer. And the reason I was kind of highlighting the fact opinion is because that some of these other answer choices might work, but you have to be really careful here. So A, exposed. She exposed that the value of photographs was informational rather than creative. You can't really expose your own opinion. You can expose something that someone did, you can expose like a secret fact, but you can't expose your own opinion. Exposing something means like, aha, this is the truth. Now I have you. Now I'm going to tell the truth to the whole world. But she's not exposing, that the value of photographs is information rather than creative. That doesn't really make a lot of sense. She's just kind of arguing. She's asserting, which means asserting means just kind of like strongly saying rather than like saying expose, like this is the truth. And when that's kind of what exposed means. So you can't expose your own opinion. Expose is kind of the wrong word to use in this situation. And then discovered is the same problem. You can discover a new fact, you can make a discovery, but she's not discovering anything. She's just arguing her opinion. Technically you can discover her opinion, but her opinion is not a fact that she discovered. She kind of thought about it and she was like, this is kind of what I think. She's not discovering the fact that photographs are more informational rather than creative. She's just kind of asserting. She's strongly saying that the value of photographs is informational, not discovering as if like she was digging and then she found this fact like, oh my god, I didn't know that. This is just her opinion. So exposed and discovered may kind of work if you're not thinking about it carefully, but this is an opinion. You can't discover your own opinion about something. That means you're discovering a fact. You can't expose your own opinion on something because that's not what she's trying to do. She's just trying to say her opinion. So exposed and discovered aren't really the right words to use in this context. And then D, doubted. She doesn't doubt her own opinion. She's trying to argue her own opinion, so doubt doesn't really make a lot of sense in this case. Asserted just means to like kind of proudly state or like firmly state that the value of photographers was informational rather than creative. So in an essay, you can assert things, you can argue things, but here in this case, she's not exposing a fact, she's not exposing a secret, and she's not discovering a secret or discovering a fact either. She's just kind of stating or asserting her opinion. So that's why asserted is going to be the best word. So here, elimination and like focusing on the fact that she's an opinion, she's a critic, not like a scientist who's exposing or discovering something. That's why asserted is going to be the best word. So you have to be really careful about the meaning of this word. All right, so this is our last example. So the following text is adapted from her short story, John Redding Goes to Sea. John wants to travel far beyond the village where he lives near his mother, Maddie. So always make sure you read this because sometimes, like in this situation, we're really gonna have to need like this information. So he wants to travel far beyond the village where he lives with his mom. John had on several occasions attempted to reconcile his mother to the notion, but found it a difficult task. Maddie always took refuge in self-pity and tears. Her son's desires were incomprehensible to her. That was all. And we need to figure out what he means. What does it mean when he's trying to reconcile his mother to the notion? Okay, so using the context that he wants to travel far beyond his village, that probably means he wants to move away from his mother, right? So that's her son's desires. His desire to travel like far away from her just didn't make sense to her. You know, it doesn't make sense to her that he wants to be so far away. That's why she always took refuge or kind of made herself look like the victim by like being like, oh my God, you're going to leave me alone, and like crying, tears. So just trying to kind of make him feel bad for wanting to go so far away from him. That's why his desire to go away is like she just doesn't understand it. And so since his mom is just like doesn't get it, just disagrees with this idea, when it says that he had attempted to reconcile his mother to the notion or the notion of going away, that probably means like he's trying to get his mother to agree, to let me travel far beyond that village. So again, yeah, these are just some keywords that I used to kind of get to the point that John wants to travel far away, but his mom doesn't want to. So what is he trying to get to do? He wants to get her to accept the notion that he wants to go. He wants her to get her to understand because she doesn't understand. They're incomprehensible. So she can't comprehend or she can't understand the desires. So he wants to make her understand. He wants to get her to understand that he wants to travel far beyond that village. So yeah, okay, here directly we kind of see our guess. It's A. So he just wants to get his mother to accept the notion that he wants to travel far away. He just wants her to accept it, so he kind of has that freedom, right? B, get his mother to apologize for. She doesn't really have anything to apologize for. She's not the one who wants to travel far away. Honestly, he should be apologizing more than anything, but he doesn't want her to apologize. He just wants her to understand, to accept. Get his mother to match to the notion doesn't really make a lot of sense. D, get his mother to reunite with. I don't know, reuniting with the notion doesn't really make a lot of sense. I mean, it might be like reuniting, like come back or understand, but I think accept is the better word. Usually just reunite with another person or like something you lost long ago. I don't think reuniting makes a lot of sense here. So he just wants to get his mother to accept the idea that he can travel. All right. Mineralogical differences are detectable in samples collected from two locations on the near-Earth asteroid Ryugu, but such differences may not indicate substantial compositional variations in the asteroid. It's a lot of big words. Cosmochemist Nagashima and colleagues note that at the small scale of the samples, the distribution of minerals is unlikely to be blank. Okay, so this passage is very sciencey and a little confusing. So let's just try to get the main idea of the text first, right? So we were talking about this asteroid, and we're saying that we took two samples from like on the Earth near the location of this asteroid, and in those small samples, we're seeing mineralogical differences. So some sort of difference between the samples, maybe, because we're collecting them from two different places, right? So we're comparing them and we're saying that there's mineralogical differences, But just because these kind of small samples show differences doesn't mean like that there's a lot of substantial compositional variation in the asteroid. So whatever like differences we're seeing like in between samples, we might not be seeing this like variation in like the stuff in the asteroid. A little confusing, but at least you get a kind of get like a sort of understanding that these minerals, these samples show sort of some sort of difference that might not actually be in the asteroid, right? So again, these are really small samples compared to a really big asteroid. So small samples may vary a lot, but this doesn't mean that the whole asteroid isn't uniform. The asteroid itself might be uniform, but the samples have a lot of variation in them. However, even if you didn't understand the stuff about the asteroid, you can kind of see that what's the sentence that we need to finish? We need to say the distribution of minerals is unlikely to be blank. So we need to figure out what are the distribution of minerals. Okay, so what are the distribution of minerals? Well, they're kind of varied. They are different from one another, right? We are looking at these samples and we're like, these two samples are different from one another. So at the small scale of these samples, the distribution of minerals is showing differences between each other. So that means they're unlikely to be similar to each other or unlikely to be the same across samples. So you don't really need to understand the whole asteroid thing because honestly it's kind of asking you to restate the same thing except it told you what it is, so now I have to word it like as if what it's not. So it's telling you that these small samples have differences between them. So another way to say that is that they're unlikely to be similar to each other. That's kind of what they're trying to say. So again, you don't have to understand all the stuff in the asteroid, although it might help. It tells you that they're different from each other, so they're unlikely to be similar to each other. So see which word kind of best matches up with this. I think uniform. So being uniform means like kind of same across the whole set of samples, but that we're saying that they're going to be different in that sample set. So they're not going to be uniform. They're unlikely to be uniform or the same. The distribution of minerals in these samples is not going to be the same for each sample, is what we're saying. Okay, so let's look at some of the other answer choices. So the distribution of minerals is unlikely to be neglected. Honestly, that's the opposite of what we're trying to say. I think because they're saying that the small samples may vary a lot, but the asteroid itself might not actually vary a lot, like in the asteroid. I think they might be neglecting this distribution of minerals or this mineral or these mineralogical differences in the samples. I think they're kind of gonna forget about them because the asteroid is kind of not going to be as uh, compositionally variable as the samples. So I think maybe neglectful is like a very negative word. So honestly, I don't know if it fits the tone of this text, but I think honestly it is more likely to be neglected rather than not because we're saying that the little differences don't really matter. B is the same thing, redundant. I think they're saying the distribution of minerals is sort of redundant here. We're saying the distribution of this uneven distribution of the minerals from sample to sample is kind of redundant. You know, it's not really, doesn't really matter because we don't think the asteroid itself varies a lot inside the asteroid. So I think it is trying to say the distribution of minerals is honestly redundant. Maybe that's what it's trying to say. See ongoing, that doesn't really make sense. That's like a time where like something is ongoing. That doesn't really make a lot of sense in this situation. Uniform is the one that makes the most sense. Again, you just have to understand that it already tells us that there are differences in the samples that they give us, and that means they're unlikely to be uniform. They're unlikely to be similar to each other. So it's just restating the same thing in a different way, which is what a lot of these vocab questions, these fill in the blank questions are trying to do. So you don't have to understand everything about the asteroid. Here it's maybe a little complicated to eliminate things. If you think about it yourself, it's easier to get to the word uniform. Again, you're just restating something that's already been said. Okay, so here we have a play. So the following text is adapted from Oscar Wilde's 1895 play, The Importance of Being Earnest. We have some dialogue. Have we got to part? I'm afraid so. It's a very painful parting. It is always painful to part from people whom one has known for a very brief space of time. The absence of old friends one can endure with equanimity, but even a momentary separation from anyone to whom one has just been introduced is almost unbearable. And we need to figure out what endure means in this play dialogue. So, what's going on? These people have, I'm sorry, these Cicely and Algernon, I guess. I guess they just met and now they have to kind of go away from each other, and it's very painful for them. And Cicely is saying that it's always painful to leave people who you've only known for a little bit of time. Okay? And then he says the absence of old friends one can endure with equanimity. Now, this might be hard if you don't know what endure means generally, and I don't even know what equanimity means either. So I don't know what it might be confusing to know what endure with equanimity means, but that's okay because we can look at the next sentence. We're saying, but, so we're using a transition, so we're saying something different here. But even a momentary separation from anyone whom has just been introduced to is almost unbearable. So in this part, we're talking about one sort of separation being unbearable. And the fact that we have the transition word but means we're talking about something different in this part compared to this part. So here, if we're emphasizing how painful it is to part from someone you just know, and this is contrasting what it's like to part with someone who you're an old friend with, maybe this is saying that the absence of old friends one can kind of bear or one can kind of be okay with. You're like, okay, I'm going to see them again. But even if a little bit of separation from someone you just met is super painful. So it's the opposite. Absence of old friends isn't that painful. You can kind of bear it. But parting with someone you just met is really painful. So that's why the word but. We're saying the experience is painful versus not painful. So again, that word but and separation from anyone who has just been introduced, looking at that next sentence gave us a lot of hints. So again, the main idea, it is harder to say goodbye to someone you have just met than someone you've known for a long time. It's not that painful to say bye to an old friend, is what we're saying. So my guess is like bear or be okay with. The absence of old friends is something that one can be okay with. So see which one best matches up with our guess. I think tolerate. So you can tolerate it. Again, I don't exactly know what equanimity means. That's okay, but I can still say the absence of old friends one can tolerate. You can endure. You can tolerate it. You can be okay with it, right? That's what we're saying. Let's look at the other ones. So A, regret. We're not really talking about regretting anything here. We're comparing the pain of parting with someone. So regret doesn't really make a lot of sense here. Persist, we're saying the one can persist, doesn't really make a lot of sense. Persist honestly means like kind of draw out the absence, but that doesn't really make a lot of sense. Why would you want to like persist or like keep the absence up or like stay away from an old friend? That doesn't really make a lot of sense. And encourage, obviously I think anyone wants to encourage the absence of really good friends, right? You probably don't want them to go away. So encourage is kind of the not really a great word. We're just saying one can tolerate their absence. Obviously, you want them to be around, but you can still tolerate it if they're away. But when you just met someone and you have to part with them, it's really painful. So we're just saying you can bear the pain versus you can't endure the pain. So that's why tolerate is going to be the best answer. Okay. This one's a little tricky, but I think we can figure it out. So, economist Marco Castillo and colleagues showed that nuisance costs, the time and effort people must spend to make donations, reduce charitable giving. Charities can mitigate this effect by compensating donors for nuisance costs, but these costs, though variable, are largely blank donation size. So charities that compensate donors will likely favor attracting a few large donors over many small donors. Okay, so what are we talking about? We're talking about nuisance costs, and we're saying that the time that it takes for people to actually like go on the website and whatever and make the donation, it kind of reduces charitable giving. So people don't really want to donate to charities because it's like seems to be so much work to make the donation. That's what we're saying. And so we're saying charities can mitigate this effect or kind of avoid this from happening by compensating donors for the nuisance cost. So we're saying they're going to give them a little something, maybe some money or maybe like a gift or something like that. when they make this donation in order to make up for the nuisance costs, like as almost like, as like an apology for that all the time and effort it took, so that they can get people to donate. And they're saying these costs, though variable, are largely blank of donation size. So when we're saying though variable, we're saying although they're variable, that's making me think they're not that variable. So although they can change a little bit, they probably can't change a lot. So they're more or less kind of in the same ballpark of an amount, right? And so we're saying the donation size can be anything, right? So I'm still thinking that there is no real relationship between the nuisance cost and the donation size. So like I can donate $100, I can donate $10. That nuisance cost might change a little, but it's going to be about the same. And so that's why charities that compensate donors will likely favor attracting a few large donors over many small donors. So they're going to want more people to pay a lot of money so that the net profit they make is more. So just to recap what we just said, so the nuisance costs vary a little but not a lot. It's kind of around the same cost no matter the donation size. So it doesn't really change a lot even if the donation size is really different from person to person. So to use an example to illustrate this, if the nuisance cost is always about $5, they want someone to donate $100 rather than $10 because that's going to be more profit. They're going to make $95 versus just $5, right? So they want more, they're okay with fewer people donating if each of those people donate a large sum of money rather than a lot of people only donating like $5 because then it would be like $0 per person, right? So that's what we're saying, that these nuisance costs don't really change with the donation size. It doesn't matter how big the donation size is, how small the donation size is. The nuisance cost is going to change a little, but not a lot. So they're not that related. So my guess would be like unrelated to. They're largely unrelated to the donation size. They don't have much to do with the donation size. It's always going to be about the same. Okay, so see which one kind of matches up with that. I think independent of does that the best. So they're largely independent of the donation size. No real relationship there. Let's look at the other answer. So A, supplemental to. Supplemental to means like added on to the donation size, but that doesn't really make sense. Like it's actually like subtracting from the donation size. It's not adding on to the donation money. It's actually like taking away from the donation money, right? So supplemental to is kind of the opposite. We're kind of lowering the net profit instead of adding to it with the nuisance cost. So that's what supplemental would mean. We're not supplementing the donation size. We're actually not really doing much to the donation size. So that doesn't really make a lot of sense. Be predictive of. Predictive of means that like you can kind of predict the donation size based on the nuisance cost. But again, not only does that not make a lot of sense, but again, we just established that there's really no relationship between the nuisance cost and the donation size. So one can't really predict or inform the other. So because there's no relationship, they can't be predictive of each other in any way. So B doesn't really make a lot of sense. D, subsumed in. Subsumed in means that the donation size kind of includes the nuisance cost, but that doesn't make sense. The nuisance cost is actually taking away from the donation size. If it was subsumed in the donation size, the amount that the charity would get would still be the original donation size. But because they're compensating them with a little bit of money, that donation size goes down a little bit. So it's not subsumed in, it's actually taken away from the donation size. So subsumed in means like there would be no change in the donation size, but it's not being subsumed in. It's actually taking away from the net donation size. It's taking away from the net profit that the charity makes. So the point is that they're independent of each other. There is no relationship between the nuisance cost and the donation size. They're unrelated to each other. It just really does not change no matter what the donation size is. So this one you have to think about a little bit, but they kind of give you hints to help you understand the fact that the nuisance cost doesn't change, especially when they kind of give that example, few large donors over many small donors. They're saying that the net profit is going to be more the larger the donation size is. So that means the nuisance cost is always going to be sort of small, sort of similar to each other. All right, so this is our very last problem. Rejecting the premise that the literary magazine Ebony and Topaz 1927 should present a unified vision of Black American identity, editor Charles S. Johnson fostered his contributors' diverse perspectives by promoting their authorial autonomy. Johnson's self-effacement diverged from the editorial stances of W.E.B. Du Bois and Alan Locke, whose decisions for their publication were more adjective, probably. Okay, so what are we talking about? We're talking about one magazine about the Black American identity, and this editor Charles, he fostered diverse perspective in his magazines, and he promoted their authorial autonomy. So autonomy means like freedom. So he gave his authors a lot of freedom to kind of write about their own kind of diverse lives, diverse opinions and perspectives, because he didn't believe that like everything in his magazine should be talking about the same sort of perspective. He doesn't want a unified vision of the Black American identity. So he gave his authors more freedom to kind of write about different perspectives, different sort of experiences, right? And we're saying his self-effacement, which I don't exactly know what that means, but that's fine. I can kind of see whatever quality. I mean, we're still talking about Johnson, so Johnson's whatever. It diverged from the editorial stances of W.E.B. Du Bois and Alan Locke. So if Johnson's editorial stance is against presenting a unified vision of Black American identity, that means Du Bois and Locke's is probably, they have editorial stance that we should present a unified vision of the Black identity. So their decisions for the publication were more uniform. I'm guessing they didn't give their authors as much freedom as Johnson did, because they kind of wanted a more controlled image. They wanted to talk about one sort of vision, one sort of perspective, right? So again, the main idea is that Johnson let his writers have more freedom of expression than the other editors talked about. So I've had to kind of come up with a guess word, like their decisions for the publication were controlled, curated, which means like you carefully put together like some sort of image, and just more uniform, like in their perspectives. They had more control over the perspective being presented in like the articles in their magazines, right? So let's see which word choice kind of matches up with this. Okay, so it's gonna have to be dogmatic. Now, this is a little tricky because these words can be a little um, unusual, especially dogmatic, which happens to be the correct answer. But the way to approach questions where you might not know the answer is just to eliminate the words that you do know first, right? So let's walk through the other ones. So A, proficient. Proficient means like better. Like if they were more proficient, that means like they were better at their job. They were more efficient or something like that. But we're not saying one is more proficient, or we're not saying one is more better than the other. We're just saying that they're different. It doesn't say that Johnson is better or Du Bois and Locke were better. We're not saying that one is better than the other. So proficient is not the right comparison to make here. C, ambiguous. That is actually kind of the opposite of what we want to say. So ambiguous is kind of more like, maybe more like Johnson. So it's not necessarily the best word, but ambiguous is like, not necessarily like one clear vision. Ambiguous, it can be this, it can be that, it can be kind of multiple things. It's just not very defined well. But I think it's the opposite. Du Bois and Locke had a really specific vision, had a really specific definition of the vision that they wanted to present, right? So it wasn't an ambiguous vision, it was really clear. Okay, let's look at choice D. So unpretentious, pretentious just by itself means you try to make yourself look better than you are, make yourself more impressive than you are. So unpretension is the opposite of that. You don't try to make yourself look more impressive than you actually are. You're like more humble, pretty much. So we're saying that their decisions for the publications were more humble, but or more modest, but I don't know about that. I don't know. It doesn't really talk about one person being more pretentious or acting like they're better than they really are compared to the other editors. So I think this one is a little irrelevant. We're not talking about kind of their egos. We're just talking about how they want more control over their vision. So unpretentious isn't really a great word here. that just leaves dogmatic. So the word dogmatic honestly sounds like sort of aggressive to me, and I think that kind of matches up. Their decisions were kind of more aggressive. They were more controlling because they just wanted that one unified vision. So not only did my elimination lead to that, it just kind of sounds like an aggressive word, which I kind of like. But dogmatic really means like you're kind of stuck to one vision. You're stubborn about like your one perspective. You're not really willing to change or embrace other perspectives, which is what we're talking about, right? Their decision for their publications kind of focused on one perspective, like one opinion, while Johnson like kind of let his authors believe and write about what they wanted to. So that's what we're talking about. They had a more curated, controlled image because they believed more in just kind of one vision rather than a diverse image. So even though you might not know what dogmatic means, try to eliminate other words and again, be confident when choosing a word that you don't know because at least you decided that the other words that you do know don't work. Alright, so that's all the problems that I have for this video. So hopefully I kind of demonstrated how we used keywords and phrases and the sentences surrounding the blank to help us find what the right meaning is, to kind of come up with our own guess and our own definition. Again, sometimes it's kind of simpler than you think. Sometimes you don't have to understand every single word in the passage. Sometimes it's just restating something already said in a slightly different way. But sometimes you do really need to read carefully. You should always be reading carefully, but sometimes you really do need to pick up on the hints that are given to you like throughout the passage to really get the idea of what the words should be. So these question types do require a lot of close reading, but with a good amount of practice, you should be getting better at it. Again, I would encourage you guys to kind of study different sorts of roots of words. Obviously, it's great to study words themselves. Like if you just search up online like popular SAT words, like there's gonna be a lot of resources for you to do, which are all helpful. But there's no guarantee that you're gonna see a word on the SAT and it's gonna be like, oh yeah, I remember that one and I studied that one. So sometimes looking up roots along with common SAT words can be helpful because they enable you to recognize at least like what a word might mean rather than just like memorizing definitions. So kind of maybe do some research on like common roots of words because that might help you recognize words that you might not know exactly the definition of. Again, always make sure trying to figure out the main idea and kind of breaking it down like we always do, and that's going to help you find out the right vocab word or the right alternative meaning of an underlined word. So hopefully this was helpful, and I will see you in the next video.